All right. Well, good evening, everybody. Let's go into show mode here. All right. Well, good evening. I'm Eleanor Rangers. I'm the president of the Southeastern Pennsylvania Cold War Historical Society. I'd like to welcome everyone to another edition of our History in Our Back webinar. I do have a just one kind request. Please, I think most everybody has done this. If you could mute your microphones and turn off your cameras for the presentation just to maximize our bandwidth, that would be very much appreciated. And again, this is another installment of our History in Our Backyard webinar series. Just a couple of announcements. For those who are on the call who are former Naval Air Development Center employees, there is going to be an open house and reunion planned for August 21st at the Fuge in Warminster, Pennsylvania. There will be more information forthcoming on this. Basically, when Doug Crompton and I finally have a chance to really organize this, but we do have it on the books for August, so there will be more details coming very soon. And as always, being a humble 501c3 organization, we do always welcome donations at your discretion. An easy way to accomplish that is actually through Amazon Smile, which is a way to basically link your Amazon purchases to a nonprofit of choice. And it's a very easy, seamless way if you do a lot of shopping on Amazon to make a small contribution from those sales to our organization. But all the proceeds go towards defraying the cost of bringing guest lecturers in from out of town when we were doing live programming, and I'm hoping to return to that someday. Transcriptions of interviews is certainly on my bucket list, and some modest costs for maintaining our websites and displays. Speaking of displays, we actually have recently been given space at the Fuge to develop a display room that we are planning on dedicating to the Naval Air Development Center history. And this is a schematic of the room. This is basically just off the entrance of the centrifuge building. And we are hoping to perhaps unveil some initial displays either at the reunion in August or shortly thereafter. So we actually, and I do want to give a shout out to Dan Myers, who helped us in identifying a woman who was actually selling some display cases. So we're hopefully picking up 3 display cases this week to at least get us started. So if anyone is interested in assisting us with the development of displays, and I'm envisioning that there may be a permanent display, but I'd like to have the opportunity to have rotating displays at some point. Please reach out to me at mail@coldwarhistory.org, and we can definitely use your assistance. Just a reminder again, I started using a new email system for sending out the monthly announcements. So if you're suddenly not receiving our emails, please check your junk mail folder or spam folder. And mail@coldwarhistory.org is the email that you should be receiving the announcements from. If you don't see those and you're, it's the day of a program and you're like, oh my gosh, how can I get information? I do always post this information on our website on the events page. I have a Facebook page as well that I regularly post events. So those are some other means of getting in touch with us and at least finding out about the ongoing programs. We also have a YouTube channel that if you happen to miss a webinar altogether, we do upload these webinars after their completion. So we have that up on the YouTube channel, as well as some other interesting Cold War related videos that we find as we scour YouTube. So we do try to add new content regularly, so it's definitely worth checking back periodically to see what's new. As I mentioned, we do have a Facebook page as another way of obtaining information about our organization. And make sure to join us next month, June 9th. Actually, George Leopold, who spoke for us back when we were doing live programming. And he's actually returning with another gentleman by the name of Andy Saunders, a gentleman from the UK who has been doing some really fabulous work on basically photo cleanup of a lot of the early space missions. And George and Andy have been working together to basically refine video and photographic evidence of the Liberty Bell 7 recovery. So they have a very interesting new theory based on this photographic evidence that basically exonerates Gus from the, the tale that's dogged him for years about whether or not he was to blame for blowing the hatch on the Mercury capsule Liberty Bell 7. So really interesting presentation, and hope you guys can make it on June 9th. Again, just my reminder about please to mute your microphones and turn off your cameras just for the presentation. So without further ado, let me introduce our guest speaker this evening, John Schell. So John graduated with a BSEE, I guess that's an electrical engineering degree, and a master's in electrical engineering in 1970 from Penn State, and also had a reserve commission with the Air Force. And he entered active duty at Wright-Patterson and worked as a radar research engineer in the Air Force Avionics Lab. And then he became a project engineer in the spotlight mode synthetic aperture radar. Subsequently, he was assigned to the SR-71 U-2 project office at Wright-Pat in 1976. And there he led the development of ASARS-1 and ASARS-2 radar prototypes for the SR and the U-2, and served briefly as the chief avionics engineer responsible for all SR-71 and U-2 mission systems. So if you have questions about radar this evening, you can also talk to John about that at the conclusion of his talk. After he left the Air Force in 1980, he supported ASAR's testing and fielding development of several image exploitation systems and development of RQ-4 Global Hawk. So has quite a varied career in aviation radar. John retired from the industry in 2016, and now he serves as a docent at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force. So welcome, John. Very happy to have you here this evening to talk about some new research that you've been working on for the past 2 years regarding the U-2 incident with Francis Gary Powers. I do also want to mention to the group that if you have interest in reading in a little more detail regarding John's presentation, he did publish his initial research in the summer 2020 issue of Air Power History. But I understand that John may be publishing an update to that research of which he's going to present this evening. So with that, I am going to pause my presentation and turn things over to John and let a bunch of other people who've been diligently in the waiting room onto the webinar. So thank you and welcome, John.
Thank you, Eleanor. Let me see if I can pull this video up here. Start video share screen. There we go. This one. Okay. What I'm going to talk about tonight, actually, I started work on about 2 years ago when Chris Pocock, who's a well-known U-2 historian. Can everybody hear me? You coming through okay, Eleanor?
Yep, we're coming through. I would ask again a reminder, please mute and turn off your cameras so everyone can hear the speaker. Thank you.
And Chris published some things on his web posting that revealed there's some new articles written by the Soviet officers who had participated in the shootdown. And so I studied those and worked with Chris to develop a potential map of how the shootdown occurred. And being an engineer, I wanted to look into it further, and he provided me some additional materials to start my research. This would have been in May 2020. As Eleanor mentioned, I've published a paper last summer on some initial findings. And just recently, I've had an exchange with a son of a Soviet officer, Sergei Selin, and he's provided some new information that I call the rest of the story. So tonight will be the first presentation of what I think is a pretty complete story. And hopefully you'll learn some things that you never knew about how the U-2 was shot down. With me also is Pranay Bardwaj. Pranay has helped me. He's a fellow engineer. He's helped me conduct some of this analysis. And so at the end, he will help answer some of your questions. So let's see here. Go forward by tapping your screen, right? How do I do that? Okay, the mouse. So the outline for tonight will a little bit of background leading up to the shootdown. The Operation Grand Slam was the mission flown by Gary Powers over the Soviet Union in May 1st, 1960. We'll talk about that. And then I'll present some of the new information, the rest of the stories, and some of the reconstructions that I've recently done. The secrets revealed will actually be information that came out of the Soviet archives. It was classified and buried for over 60 years till the Soviet officers dug them out and published some new papers. So I'll highlight some of those secrets and summarize and conclude. And then at the end, we'd be glad to answer questions. So we'll start with the initial U-2 capability, how the SA-2 works, as well as the events leading right up to May 1st, 1960. The U-2 was a aircraft that was designed for surveillance and reconnaissance, obviously, but its advertised role was it was used for weather research. It was flown by NASA. Flown by the CIA. So it was a CIA mission, but it was given a NACA, which is a forerunner of NASA marking, and they were advertising that what they were conducting is upper atmosphere weather research. But this didn't really fill the Soviets. They knew that it was used for reconnaissance. SAC provided the pilots and the maintenance. Area training was done at the Area 51. People were brought in mainly through the Air Force, but also just from others, pilots from others, non-service pilots that brought in. They were given false ID as a under air weather research under the USAF. So Gary Powers, for instance, had the ID of Francis Gary Palmer as a GS-12 in the Air Weather Service. All the missions were conducted by the CIA with extreme secrecy. They planned the mission, the targets, they did the exploitation, and analysis, and provided the reports to the president. The detachments were flown, they flew out of 4 areas. The 2 detachments that were used for oversight or overflight of the Soviet Union were Wiesbaden Air Base, Germany, and Incirlik in Turkey. So those were where the missions were flown out. Initially, the U-2 had a film camera called the A2. There were 3 of them actually. It's a tri-camera system. It provided about a 30-mile wide swath at about 4-foot resolution. That was the primary sensor that was used for collections. Now it also recorded electronic signals from the ground. So it would record radar signals, radar emitters, and then they would be analyzed post-flight. So it was recorded on magnetic tape. And they could also record some communication signals. The drift sight in the cockpit, you'll see there in the middle, the big round drift sight, that could be pointed up for a star fix, meaning you could do a position fix and update your autopilot, or you could also point it down and use it for camera alignment. For the Grand Slam mission, there was an upgraded camera that had been put on about a year earlier called the panoramic B camera. Now that would be a step camera that had 7 different step positions from one side to the other. You went through all 7 steps, you'd have a 350-mile wide panoramic view. Normally, they would do a 3 position to the left or 3 position to the right, which would cover about 21.5 nautical miles off of either side. So normally you would image on one side or the other with that camera. It had much improved resolution. It was now about 2.5-foot resolution. For Grand Slam, and about that time now, our main interests were the ICBM test facilities as well as the ICBM sites themselves. And on the right is an image that was taken on their equivalent of Cape Kennedy, where they did a lot of their early ICBM testing. And so we overflew that area quite often. To talk about a little bit about how the SA-2 works, we have to start with the PVO, which is called the Troops of Soviet Air Defense. The PVO included all their air interceptors as well as all their surface air missiles were under the PVO. And it also included early warning systems that look far over the horizon. And this would then give them an early warning for both to set up interceptors and to prepare to fire missiles. In terms of the missiles themselves, the missile sites they had a brigade headquarters. Under them, there were SA-2 missile battalions. So the brigade headquarters and the SA-2 battalion shared a common radar for target acquisition. That's shown up above on the left. The NATO name Spoon Rest, it could look out, it circularly scanned so that antenna would move around about 6 revolutions per minute. And it could go out to about 108 nautical miles. It has separate IFF interrogator that's not shown. And what the Spoon Rest did is it would determine the range, the elevation angle, the bearing, and the speed of the incoming target. By knowing that the IFF, there's no IFF response, they know it's an alien target and not one of their own. So if we look to the right, that's the inside of a Spoon Rest fan. The elevation display is on the left. The plan position indicator, or the one that does bearing and range, is on the right. And that PPI display can be electronically moded. So you have got those at the brigade as well as at the missile battalions. I'm going through all this, I should say, to set the stage for how the U-2 was shot down. It's radar intensive. And so if you understand how the missile worked and how these radars work, a lot of what I'm going to say about the shoot down will make sense. So at the brigade and at the battalions, they had a remoted display of the Spoon Rest. And you'll see in the center of that remoted display. What they did in their command centers of both is they would plot on a glass tablet the range and position every minute. And so depending what range scale they would be on, it would depend that those circles would be larger or smaller. And so they would have a common picture of which direction and where they're coming in from. And after the mission, they would take and put tracing paper over that and trace that path and then overlay that tracing paper onto a map. And they have a final map showing the route, and that would be a permanent record of where this unidentified or target aircraft came in from. Once they had determined that they wanted to fire on it, brigade would then pass that to the battalions, which had a tracking radar called, the NATO nickname was Fansong. It's 2-dimensional scanning in elevation and in azimuth, and it scans a sector. So what Fansong does is it rotates that whole thing around and centers the sector scan on the bearing and elevation that was given to it from the Spoon Rest. So it's tracking the target, and as a missile is fired, it also tracks the missile. So with knowing where the target is and the missile is, they can provide missile guidance commands up the antenna. A computer will provide the missile guidance. It calculates the lead angle and so forth to lead the missile, because it's a slow turning missile. The SA-2 is relatively slow turning relative to how quickly the U-2 could turn. And so they always want to track both and then fire and track to where they would detonate. They would normally fire 3 missiles because they would increase their probability by firing 3 missiles. So normally it wouldn't be just 1, but 3 to enhance the probability of a shoot down. The missile itself has 2 stages. The first stage is a rocket. It's solid state, and so it burns off after about 4 seconds. What's shown over here on the right is the second stage. You'll see the guidance antenna on the back. There's where the missile commands were received. It sends down a beacon, because the missile is very small. To allow fan song to track it, there's a beacon signal that comes down at a different frequency from that missile. So you've got 3 different missiles, each with a different beacon frequency, and they can all be seen on the single fan song display. They launch, the firing off, once the computer says you're within range of being able to detonate the warhead, they will, the commander will give a launch command to a firing officer, and he manually launches the missiles and it's automatically guided to the target. Again, he's given by the commander to unarmed command. There's a signal that goes off from the computer, says you're within range to arm the warhead. And so the commander directs that it be armed, and that arming command is sent up. And right on the front of the missile, you see a little antenna called the proximity antenna. There's actually, I think, about 3 of them. You're seeing one here on the lower right side there. And that tracks the missile on into proximity of the target, about 80 meters. And then it can self-detonate. So it will detonate after it's been armed if it gets into 80 meters. Now, if it's never armed or never gets close, it self-detonates after about a minute. So this thing is not going to fall on friendly troops. It's either going to hit the target or it's going to blow itself up. And if it loses guidance, it's just going to go in the same direction it was last told to go. So these are sometimes called flying telephone poles because they're long and skinny. Now, if we look at the sequence of events leading up, this is very interesting how things happened. The Soviets, Nikita Khrushchev and the whole Soviet Union in the competition for the arms race were boasting, what they had and how good they had it. Eisenhower was often pressed in doing reconnaissance to confirm, are we really behind the Soviets? Now, early on, it was about a bomber gap. They thought maybe we were behind them in B-52s. We really weren't. The same thing happened with missiles. The first Sputnik was shot up by what became the first Soviet ICBM. When this SA-2s went into operation a little bit later, Eisenhower terminated overhead flights for about a period of a year or more, a little bit over a year. And by then we had 19 overflights in, had gotten a lot of intelligence. And now we are in a position of tracking and determining, where are they in terms of making missiles? Well, they were boasting, we're making them like sausages, we've got enough to wipe our enemies off the face of the earth. And they falsely announced that we're ready, we're operational in February '59. So much pressure was built up in Congress and in the news by those open boasts that Eisenhower reluctantly resumed overflights again over missile facilities and the like. He also flew over some SA-2 test facilities. Two of the flights were flown by British pilots. And so we flew another, after 19, we threw another 4 flights, the last flight being in mid-April of 1960 over Tyura Town. Now that one was interesting. They had taken off from, they even though Incirlik was their base, they ferry the airplanes over to Peshawar, which is in Pakistan. And from there, they took off to the northeasterly direction. They were being tracked right away with early warning radar. So, and they came in, it was over an 8-hour mission and flew over and landed safely back in Turkey. And that brought a lot of concern out of Khrushchev. He basically reprimanded the PVO forces, demoted some of the junior officers. They were blamed of criminal negligence. And personally, Khrushchev talked to the head, Air Marshal Berezov. He said, you should have known where they were coming in better position of forces. So he put the head of the whole PVO on notice that this is intolerable. So the next flight was going to be later that April, and it was delayed due to weather. And they didn't want to delay too much because in May, that 1960, there was a planned peace talks in Paris with the Soviets, the United States, and 2 others, a 4-way peace talk in Paris in late May of 60. So he wanted to get that in well in advance. And May 1st was the very last day they could fly. According to Eisenhower, put that restriction on. So May 1st became the date. They worked into it by weather delays and exercise delays. And Operation Operation Grand Slam was now on the way. So we're going to talk about that. You're going to see tonight the complete time sequence of the shoot down. Is something I don't think you'll see anywhere else. And I'll also have shown you the information I just received that I think completes the rest of the story. Pranay and I did a little bit of reconstruction on how the missile fell, or how the missile detonated and the U-2 fell. And I will reveal what they found in the what was found in the archives, the secrets from the archives. So it's a really long flight, as I mentioned, out of Peshawar, now more to the northwest. And the question is, will they be ready? They were going to fly up over Turitam again, Chelyabinsk, where they had do nuclear fuels work, at Mayak, also where they produced nuclear fuel enrichment, and up the Sverdlovsk area, and up towards into the Urals, towards Kirov. That's where the missile site, some of the missile production sites would be up in the Urals. There's also a plant, though, in Sverdlovsk that they were planning to image. And you go on up further, Plesetsk was a known, up there in the northwest, is a known ICBM site they were going to visit. And not showing on my screen, but up there at the top, there's the western port for their submarines. And then they're going to land in Norway. So it's a long flight. And it was delayed in taking off, but delayed by about, I think it was about 4 hours. So power set on the ground until they got the go-ahead order. And that then meant that he couldn't use the Astra tracker or the Star tracker, because all of his readings now would be off depending on where he was. So he had to go on manual, basic gyro compass for autopilot, updated by radio ADF. So he was on that, flying autopilot on up into the Soviet Union, but no star fixes. So let's go through the time sequence of the shoot down. First, we need to mention that the district headquarters for the PVO in this region was an airfield called Koltsovo Airfield. So one floor had the air interceptor commands at it. The other floor commanded all the surface to air missile brigades in the area. And the first ones up was two Su-9s. They were prototypes. They were sent down and they were available. And so the general sent them out on an order to find and ram the U-2s. They didn't have any weapons. They were prototypes. So they took off with a suicide mission. There were two of them. And they took off and flew to the south looking for the U-2 as it was way far to the south still, well below Khartoum. So they were looking down there for it. And as they returned, two MiGs were launched. They now had missiles. They couldn't get up as high as the Su-9s, but they were launched at 8:43. And just after that, one Su-9 returned. And I'll talk about the first one, what happened to it in a minute. So the first thing that happened as he entered into this area, he had flown through the south. He had thrown through three different SA-2 battalions. Two of them were away on training, so they didn't shoot him down. The third one that he flew through had a sudden transmitter problem, so they didn't shoot him down. So now he's on his fourth site that he's flying through, which is labeled number 1 there. It's the 5th Battalion. And the 5th Battalion took some time to figure out which is a U-2 and which is the returning Su-9. And it also had some issues with the differences in radar readings between the brigade and the battalion. So the commander took some time to figure out what was going on. And he commanded a launch, and the firing officer pressed the button to launch it. Nothing happened. Well, he searched around, figured out what's going on. Well, he had forgot to move the launch setting from test to operate. So after a couple more minutes, and just as Powers is about to leave the area, he figures that out. He launches the missile at 8:46 a.m., just after Powers makes a turn. Now you'll notice the kill radius I use here is 32 kilometers. So just after he makes the turn, the missile strikes about 1 minute later. It was armed at 53 seconds. All these numbers, by the way, are out of the official hidden record. So these aren't made up by me or made up by some Soviet officer. These are what's in the record of the 5th Battalion that was buried. So the missile struck him, and where we showed Chris and I, this is Chris map, the map that Chris and I put together in May of 2020. And we projected that what happened is after that, the aircraft spun into the area of another battalion, the 2nd Battalion. So you'll see it going, the pieces going up there to the northeast. The 2nd Battalion at Kosalino was there, number 2. It detects the incoming SA-2, but it also detects jamming. Well, there's no jammer on the U-2. The U-2 doesn't even know it's being shot at, but it detects jamming. And so the question is, did it hit or did it lose track because the jammer blinded the tracking system to guide the missile? So we'll answer that in a little bit later. I figured that out, I think. So now we have Powers pushing his way out of his inverted spinning aircraft, parachuting to Earth, and we have pieces of the U-2 pushing down to Earth. You see the blue dots. Blue dots are the different pieces. The right wing broke off first. These are where they were located and reported on in the official report. The left wing broke off second. The main body is right up there, right beside the number 2. That's the main body. But before it landed, it flung out the the engine and the tail. The engine's right over by A, and way up to the dot up the north is how far the tail section traveled. So those are the 5 major pieces that were found on the ground. Well, up there, up above here to the north, there's another battalion that's centered number 3, and you'll see its circle barely coming down there. You see it's got the same radius, and it fires 3 missiles at 055, 0855. But what were they firing at? Well, I've got some of the answers, I think, now. They're coming up. Remember the MiG-19s that were flying around looking for the SA-2. There's a flight of 2 of them. Well, the commander over at number 4, which is the 4th Battalion at Rashidi, he sees 2 low flying airplanes. Little, and it's a little strange because that's not the L-2 of a U-2. He calls in to headquarters, the district headquarters, and says, "What's going on? Do I have permission to shoot?" They said, "Well, we've got a report from the 5th Battalion, but we don't believe it's impossible to shoot at a target that's moving away. So that can't be right. We don't have any other reports. The other battalions haven't reported in. So it must be Powers. Go ahead and fire." So they fired 3 missiles at 9:22. Well, what did they catch? They struck a MiG-19. There were 2 MiG-19s up, but they got 1 of them. That guy came down very valiantly. He purposely steered his airplane, missing a Mayday parade in a small village. He steered it right into a field and died on impact. And so the missile struck at 0933, or no, 923. You note a half hour after Powers was shot down. There's 2 other numbers on this map here. There's 6 and 5. 6 is a center of a site that hadn't been activated. If it had, it probably would have had a shot at it. Number 5 had been activated, but that battalion had transmitter problems. And so they were busy driving to find a part, the transmitter magnetron, and they had to drive about 18 miles to go get it, bring it back. And then by the time they got it back, Powers is gone. So they never shot at it. So Powers could have, if he hadn't been caught by that first missile there, he could have escaped up to the northwest and been on his way. So sometimes doing historical research is like digging for gold. You go through a lot of dirt until you find a nugget. And I started thinking after I'd written my paper that, there could be some information if I could get my hands on these radar tracings. The real ones. What did they say? So Google allows us to, or I think I used Word to translate from English to Russian. So I translated from English to Russian, put it in an email, and sent it to Sergei Salem, the son of the radar engineer at the 5th Battalion. And he responded. This is all this year, this January. Well, what Sergei gave me was this. He said, here's the original tracing that was made of the shootdown. You'll see the U-2 route going straight through the 5th. You see the 5th Battalion, that's right up there. I don't know if my cursor shows or not, but the 5th Battalion is right there. So he's passing about where Chris and I had plotted him. So he's going straight. Here's the path of the SU-9s. Just go down along here, and about here, one SU-9 ran out of fuel. He landed in a grass strip right down in this area, south Kushtum. The other one now is moving on up through, crossing under the U-2, moving around into position to land at Kosovo Airfield. So that's the guy that landed a few minutes after the MiGs took off. I mean, this is a whole circus of aircraft and missiles and everything else going on here. You think it's just a simple mission shoot down, but there's a lot more going on here. And so that made some sense to me. It seemed to track with what Powers had said. He said he was flying a straight leg, made a left turn, was hit about a minute after the turn. So that all added up. But what about, remember we talked about that missile, the 3 missiles up there that were north of the Cosolino, the one from Manette. Well, what had happened there is that SU-9 came into land. He was detected by that radar. So he was flying at about, I think, 9 kilometers. He brought her down. He brought the SU-9 down below 3 kilometers. You get down that low and the missile, the tracker can't see, you're too low to be tracked. So what I believe happened is those 3 missiles self-detonated because they'd gone to the mass range and he was coming in on the final, straight in on the final. So I think the 3 missiles were fired at an unidentified SU-9. Now, why wasn't he identified as a friendly? Well, I found out from Sergei the answer. When the Soviets send up a 2-ship formation to prevent co-channel interference, only the lead ship had IFF transponder active. The wingman had no IFF transponder active. This guy was the wingman. So his transponder wasn't there. He wasn't working. So he was being identified as a target or an alien coming in. So they're going to shoot at him. Now we have the other mystery of what happened, what really happened at the second at Cosolino. Well, again, I mentioned earlier, there would be a debris cloud from the detonation. So the debris cloud, I believe, is what caused them to, they thought they were seeing jamming. No, it was debris from the missile and the aircraft was inside the debris. And so you see the radar scopes here. I've enlarged it in the top. The one is from the elevation scanner, the other one's from the azimuth scanner, and you'll see the debris. And if you could see it like that, the computer can't track it. So I believe that they lost the tracking. And I believe the single missile they fired went off, self-detonated, and Powers was now spitting down under them. It somewhat correlates with what I found out from Sergei, that one of the reasons that it wasn't reported on is the commander didn't know what was going on. So he stepped outside. He saw a parachute coming down, and it was only after as his missile was exploding. So, you know, it could have been his missile if Powers was parachuting down already. It wasn't his missile that hit him. And so in his report, he just said, I'm really unable to assess results. He knew he fired a missile. He documented that, but he never documented any arming or any results. So I think what happened here is, again, it was missed. And so we've got in total, you've got 8 missiles fired. They bring down 1 U-2 and it brought down 1 MiG-19. And if it weren't for, I want to go back here, I missed a point. If it weren't for some luck here, this guy, the wingman, SU-9, would have been hit also. That guy was Captain Metyukov, M-E-T-Y-U-N-K-O-V, Metyukov. Well, Metyukov actually, when he was higher, he saw the missiles being launched at him. So that's why he ducked down real quick. He actually said to Sergei, he says, I saw them coming up at me and I ducked down. As soon as I ducked down, I was safe. So that's how he got out. We could have had SU-9, a MiG-19, and an SU-2 all down that day. That would have been even more horrible. So let's look at the reconstruction. From the eyewitness reports in the papers that were written, they say it passed over south of a site called Sergei. I've got that on there in blue now. It imaged Mayak nuclear facility. I've got, you see it's within range to image that. It's down there in the bottom of the page. It's flying beside Kustum, but Kustum's inoperable and makes the right turn. The right turn is confirmed by Powers. He said they made the right turn on up into the fifth, straight leg up into the fifth. Flew for about 4 minutes and made a left turn. So it's documented by both Powers and by the radar that he flew between the 5th Battalion and the 6th Battalion. And he made a slow left turn south, about 30 nautical miles south of Sverdlovsk. So you can see once here again, he could have been off to the Urals if he hadn't been hit right here. He just about got out of there. And so I plotted now on this new plot is updated the actual coordinates, and it was about 21.5 miles southeast of Sverdlovsk. So if we look at the push out of Powers, the detonation is documented by Kelly Johnson, and it was also documented by, see, where else did I see that? I found another documents, but it was confirmed by a Lockheed analysis that the missile detonated from the right rear, so below, behind, and to the right. And a possible loss of the horizontal stabilizer on the right side, but certainly loss of control, because Powers, as soon as he got hit, he was thrust forward, but he was able to level the wings, so he had roll control, but he had no pitch control, and so the nose of the aircraft just went down like he was going into a descent, and then the aircraft flipped over into a spin, an inverted spin. That's reported by Powers. Also, Powers said, you know, just before I bailed out, pushed out, because he's inverted now. He really can't go up. He has to go down. He's pushing himself out. He saw the altimeter at about 34K feet. So it's been an estimate by Gary Powers Jr., and I think it's reasonable that he probably left at about 30,000 feet. He said the altimeter is unwinding very, very fast before he pushed out. So Pranay and I did some analysis, and this is all approximations. These are not exact numbers, but these are about what we think occurred. The U-2 is falling about 7,200 feet per minute at a glide slope of 2 to 1. He pushed out about 13 nautical miles from the detonation in about 5.5 minutes after the detonation. So he's up here with this blue star. That's about where he's at when he pushed out. Now the white wing came off first. It was damaged during the strike, during the warhead detonation. So it's in a 38 RPM clockwise spin, and it broke off from downbending. Again, the downbending part comes from Lockheed. They said that's how the wing broke from their analysis, from downbending, meaning that it's upside down and the pressure's pushing the wings down, which are up in terms of inverted. And that would have occurred just slightly beyond that, where he was pushed out not long afterwards at 14.9 nautical miles. From previous tests of the U-2, there were 2 other incidents where this happened to a test aircraft, where it went into an inverted spin and broke apart. And it started when the spin gets fast enough, and when you get to the denser air, there's enough pressure, because they're not stressed for high G loading at all. And that breakup starts at about 25,000 feet. And that's what Pranay and I used, is where the wing would have separated at about 25,000 feet. And it was flung forward. Slightly to the right, and another half mile it lands on the ground. And that then is where it was found. So this is a rough analysis just to show that the destination point that I calculated most recently is plausible. We might find something that'll change us in the future, but right now, I think this is fairly close. You know, you could be a few miles off, but not much more than that. I mean, we're not much more than a few miles away here. So let's talk about what happened afterwards. That's the whole story of the shoot down sequence, what happened at each site, you know, six missiles fired to, let's say, eight missiles fired, 2 airplanes down. Gary Powers went to trial and found guilty of espionage, sent to prison. I think it was about 18-year term, but he only served about 1.5 years till he was released and traded for 2 Soviet spies. Lieutenant Safronov was awarded the Order of the Red Banner is for his heroism during that time. The Air Marshal Bruzov went to the parade and told Khrushchev this story. He said to Khrushchev, whispered in his ear, "We fired 2 missiles at a target that was 2 aircraft that were merged as one blip. And when the 2 aircraft separated, one missile took down the U-2, the other missile took down the MiG-19. Why do I know that's a true story? Well, that came from Khrushchev's son. Sergei Khrushchev became an American citizen. He wrote about this. I have it referenced in my references. He said that I was standing right there when Air Marshal Bruzov told that to Khrushchev. So that was a story that we told, which we know is misinformation. It was the best they could put together, but even Bruzov knew that really didn't hang together, but he was under such pressure to come and report some success. We took down the invader. Yeah, we took down our MiGs too by mistake. The 2nd Battalion and their whole brigade received awards. They were recognized as heroes. And the records are classified and sent to the archives. So what did the archives say? That's the reason I'm going to talk about those now. Secrets from the archives. Well, the first thing the report said, the investigation report said, well, the U-2 was out of range, meaning it was going away from the 5th. You can't strike. It's impossible to strike a target that's departing. Well, they certainly did. U-2 was hit by a missile from the 2nd Battalion. I don't think so. There's no evidence to convince me that it actually hit. We know it was fired, but we don't know that it struck. There's nothing in the report, and even to this day, the commander, Major Voronov, has never been able to explain what happened to his missile. Oh, and by the way, in order for it to hit the U-2 from the rear and behind, the U-2 turned 180 degrees and used radar jamming. U-2 is not going to first, it didn't have radar jamming, and it's not going to turn 180 degrees all of a sudden. And 4th Battalion, well, it fired to finish the U-2 off. Well, that's kind of a true story. They thought it was the U-2, but really it wasn't. So that's kind of semi-true. But the point of all of this, the report, it was tailored to protect the upper level PVO. In fact, Marshal Bruzov it actually worked because 2 years later, he was appointed Soviet Chief of Staff. So these things were hidden in the archives, weren't uncovered till, I think, about 2002. Now, there are a bunch of proficiency shortfalls too that came out if you carefully read these things. It took several minutes to figure out where the U-2 versus the Su-9 was. And the commander wasn't sure his IFF was working properly because why would he see the Su-9? The firing officer, well, we remember he had forgotten to move the launch control. It took a few minutes to resolve that. And it was fired just as the U-2 was about to leave the area. It should have been caught much earlier. And because it wasn't the concept that you could shoot at a departing target, brigade headquarters said, well, let's check this out before I forward it to district headquarters. I'm not sure that could be correct. So they spent about 8 minutes back and forth before they sent it on up to headquarters, which also disbelieved it. So yeah, the Fifth was the only fully trained SA-2 battalion. So this is the best of the bunch that day. They had been through the full set of training for the SA-2. Some other problems that happened. Well, the different floors, the air defense commanders and the missile defense commanders didn't talk to each other. Their staffs didn't coordinate. So the missile guys didn't know what's happening with the interceptor. They weren't aware where they were, what was happening. The MiG-19 was shot down 30 minutes after the U-2 was shot down. And the air hunt continued. And believe it or not, they put Minkov back up in the air. As soon as he landed his Su-9, they refueled him and sent him back up. So now we had two MiGs and an Su-9 back up in the air, an air circus looking for a U-2 that was already on the ground. So I mentioned earlier that Bronov from the 2nd Battalion was never able to assess what happened. So he flew for 4 battalions before he was shot at. Now, what also, and this is new to me, that came from Sergei this January, the map, the tracing that came out of the report is different than the map that they were given. Notice the U-2s and the Su-9 tracks have been changed. So the Su-9 now is going up straight, not up through the 5th Battalion, but it's going straight. And the U-2 is circling around to the right, like it's coming right into the 2nd Battalion at Cosolino. Well, that's to support that argument that, yeah, that Cosolino's shot down. But there's got to be a couple problems, at least a couple. I've got a list of about 6 or 7, but 2 of the predominant ones are, this is a long flight for the U-2, and he's not going to make a bunch of turns because they're fuel inefficient. So on this mission, they wanted to fly a lot of straight legs, and this kind of maneuver would cost a lot of gas. And Powers is he was no longer an autopilot; he was manually flying by this time, and he would know. He would remember if he was making a bunch of short turns. The other thing is if the radar here at the second were pointed over here at the U-2, it couldn't see the debris cloud from the missile explosion over here. What would it be jamming? It'd be pointing directly away from what they thought was a jamming. So what they report seeing on their scope, I don't think would be possible if they looked to the east. So again, this came from Sergei just this year, and I think it fills in. Again, the story is to try to put as much emphasis together and hang together as much as they can to support what was originally told to Khrushchev at the parade. And last, the senior investigator, so each group that they interviewed, don't ever discuss your participation in this day with anybody. Kind of a stern warning. So what are my conclusions? And these are slightly different than they were before. I now pretty firmly convinced it was the 5th, 57th Brigade that shot it down. They received no commendations, but they've held their silence for 50 years. radar engineer in the bottom, Boris Schell, and it's his son, Sergey, is the one that sent me this information recently. And there's a picture, that's a Google Earth picture of the site as it looks today. You see a lot of trees there. And the trees have grown up a lot since they moved the site, but that's one of the things that makes the kill zone somewhat indeterminate, even though the missile could fly out further. If you had a lot of trees blocking the elevation, you'd have to bring the kill zone in closer. So it depends on how it was that day, exactly how far out they could go. Pretty sure now the 2nd Battalion self-detonated high in the sky. If you Google today, the shoot down of Gary Powers, you will get, it was shot down by the 2nd Battalion commanded by Major Voronoff. I believe in the conclusion, the maintenance and readiness were totally inadequate. He almost escaped the Sverdlovsk region and was on his way into the Urals to map the where most of the production sites for the ICBMs were at the time. They were making them up in the Urals, protected away from prying eyes. The procedures, our ops procedures were, inadequate. It took several minutes to figure out what was going on. Warhead debris was mistaken for jamming. The interceptor forces, missile forces didn't talk to each other. And they really didn't understand how the U-2 could hit parting targets. And again, once again, foot stomp. The records are classified and very to protect the careers of PVO, particularly the upper echelon. In military terms, and I think you all know what a FUBAR is, it was a FUBAR. You know, it's air circus and missile circuits. And has never been used as a case study in any Soviet military schools. Let's look forward, just getting near the end here. So in 1962, Henderson was shot departing Cuba. So we have 2 cases where our U-2s have been shot down, both of them where they were departing the area. The Soviets really did learn how to use the system and maintain it. In fact, they taught the Vietnamese how to do it. And during Vietnam, it was a very formidable weapon system. For a long time, it kept us from coming in with our bombers until we find a way to defeat it. Overall, it's become the world's most predominantly used surface-to-air missile system. The U-2 flies on today. It's the 2nd longest flying aircraft in the United States Air Force after the B-52. And it provides timely intelligence. I want to thank Eleanor and the Cold War Historical Society for hosting us. I also want to give credit once again, or thanks once again, very much to my friend Chris Pocock, who has helped me get started on this and guided me. A lot of errors that I made along the way. I want to thank other people for their review, including Gary Powers Jr., who's made some great suggestions. And lastly, thank to Pranay, who's helped me do some of the analysis. So now it's time for any questions you might have.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much. I know we have a number of questions that are in the chat, so I'm going to go there first. And then I have some questions as well. So let's see. So the first question was by Gary Powers Jr., who is on the call this evening. So thank you, and a shout out to Gary. But there was a question from Joe Ramito that before May 1st, what protected the U-2? Was it limited altitude of the missile? And we did get an answer to that from Gary, but John, if you'd like to basically add to that for the group.
What was the question again?
The question was, before May 1st, 1960, what protected the U-2? Was it the limited altitude of the SA-2 missile?
What protected it? It really didn't have any protection. The missile that shot it down was put in service about a year before 1960. It was put in service in 59, I believe. I think basically they were extremely lucky that they weren't tracked early. That was one of the things Eisenhower was worried about. If they saw some early warning radars with sufficient lead time, they could send up enough interceptors and position missiles to do an interception. But the U-2 didn't have any inherent protection that I would call protection against the SA-2. It had no countermeasures, and it was flying slow enough the SA-2 could get it. The only if the pilot knew he was being fired upon, they could turn quicker than the missile could turn. So if he knew a missile coming up where, he could make a quick turn. But I think we just had we're very lucky not to have been shot down. It was just a matter of time till we did get shot down.
Okay. I know Gary, just to supplement this, he had commented on chat that initially the U-2s could fly at 70 to 75,000 feet, and that would keep them out of range of the SA-1s. But to your point that, eventually that range of the SA-2 was improved, and they could eventually reach that 70,000 plus range.
Okay. If you're talking about it, yeah, if you're talking about altitude, the new engine that was put in the U-2C did allow it to climb up to 75,000 or so. It would typically cruise, though, at less around 70, and the earlier engines would be somewhat lower. And you're right, the SA-1 the earlier SA systems were pretty much ineffective in how they were deployed and used. So it was really the SA-2 was really the only real threat to the U-2.
Okay. Another question was, just to clarify, the 32-kilometer kill radius. Was that the range of the missile or some other number? Can you just explain that for the?
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's an important question. A very important question. Actually, if you reference several references, the slant range of that 13D Desna missile is 37 kilometers on the radar slant range. If you take and figure out what's the minimum launch elevation angle into account, you're going to bring that into about 32 to 34 kilometers. So depending, you could theoretically, if you had flat Earth, you could shoot a slant range of 37 kilometers. But still, if you project that onto there, 37 with the angle, you're still going to, what I'm showing is ground range ring there. Those are not slant range. So the ground range rings are going to be less, 34, 30, that area.
Okay. Paul Schaefer has a question. What is the ramification of flying on May Day on the tracking and shoot down? Paul, I'm not sure I totally understand the question. I don't know if you want to come off mute and maybe clarify for us.
Well, I think that that Gary Jr. sort of answered this, in that fact there was not a lot of air traffic over Russia during that time, and therefore we were easier to track. Gotcha.
Okay.
Well, I will point out that they downed as soon as the early warning radars detected the U-2 coming in. They grounded all their civilian flight in the region, not across the entire range, but in that region, all civilian airplanes were commanded down, so they were cleared out.
Yeah.
So that meant only thing would be up would be their own military aircraft or the U-2.
So in other words, it was an extra dangerous day to fly.
Well, no, the May 1st, there wouldn't have been any day where they would detect the U-2 coming in. This is one of the first 2 times where they really had good early warning detection. They would ground their civilian aircraft. So early on, there's questionable whether we were being tracked early, some of the early missions, whether they're really tracking us early. And that's one of the things that Eisenhower did not really want to take an undue risk. And the CIA, that flight, the middle of April flight that I talked about that went over to Yuritam and Kapistan Yar and so forth. Well, that one, the CIA, by analyzing the tapes, the magnetic tapes from the signals, saw that, yes, they were being tracked. Now, that was up to the northeast, not to the northwest, but still they had early warning, and they didn't tell the president. They purposely withheld that information from Eisenhower because they wanted the intelligence really badly, and they were willing to risk a pilot. So if they had told him, if they had told Eisenhower, I believe there's a chance he would have nixed called the mission off. But they didn't, and he let it go forward as long as they didn't get too close to the peace talks in May. That was kind of the reason for the cutoff date of May 1st.
Right. Dan Myers has a question. Did the U-2 have missile detection capabilities?
It does now. It did a little bit later, but at that time, no. The only detection capability it has was for air-to-air radars. So it could detect some other airborne interceptor radar. It had a missile detection capability for that, but he had no warning that a SAM was illuminating him at all. SAM radar was illuminating or had been launched. Nothing. He was flying blind.
In terms of the Soviets, did they monitor the U-2 launch bases to know when a U-2 was taking off? Did they have that capability?
You mean like visibly being there, as eyes on target, eyes on the launch?
I don't know, Dan, if you want to elaborate at all.
Yeah, where did they hang out at the base and monitor air traffic control? You know, the tower, or whatever. Did they know it was the U-2 was taking off, and yeah, visually see it taking off?
Well, I've never, I don't know that they were or weren't, but I've never heard of it. And I do know that what they did for the U-2, for instance, when they launched out of Peshawar, they would fly the U-2 over in I believe it was a C-124 during the night, put it in the hangar inside, and wheel it out early morning for takeoff. So they basically kept it hid most of the time from prying eyes. But I don't know that they had, guys observing nearby or not.
The USSR in 1960 had a big presence in Afghanistan. They were building a lot of infrastructure projects like the Salang Tunnel. So they certainly had lots of people on ground in Afghanistan, and Peshawar is like it's almost on the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. So I mean, we can, I mean, yeah, it's difficult to say if somebody saw the airplane take off, and even if they did, could they identify what plane this is and where it's going?
I know that I believe that we tried to keep them pretty much under wraps in the hangar until just before takeoff.
I have a question about, and this I'm assuming probably has something to do with the flight characteristics of the U-2, but the route that it took was almost exactly a straight line, basically over the sites that they wanted to photograph. But my question is, if you know where those battalions are located, if the U-2 maybe was more maneuverable, could they have just flown around the battalions just out of that 32-kilometer kill zone and then fly, to zip over to take a photograph of the target and zip out, to the next target? Or is that a limitation of the U-2, that it was not, was it not capable of very rapid changes in flight? Or I don't know if you can elaborate on that at all. I mean, basically, it's kind of, it seemed to me like a sitting duck in a way, because it's got to go right through multiple battalions to get
Well,
its photographs.
Well, see, yeah, you got the dilemma there. The sites they want to protect had SA-2 sites nearby. So MAEC had SA-2 sites, Sverdlovsk had SA-2 sites, and there'd be no way of avoiding them. We knew about most of them, many of them. And if we planned a lot of dodging around, we wouldn't have had enough fuel to make the whole distance. So yeah, the U-2 could fly however you want to do it, but this long a trip, you couldn't make a bunch of turns. There was enough fuel to do it.
Yeah.
And you don't have to fly right over the target. You have to fly close enough so the camera can see it. You don't have to fly directly over the target. But there's
Okay.
enough SA-2 sites ringing these places. They're going to get you if they're working. And if the people aren't out for training.
Yeah. Another question. Now, obviously, there's the part of the U-2 is on display in Moscow at the, I guess their equivalent of the Air and Space Museum. Is that the engine and fuselage that they have on display? What happened to, I mean, obviously, you talked about exactly where the right, left wing, engine, fuselage, and then tail fell. Did they recover all parts of all those parts of the U-2? If they did, where are they, or are they all on display? Because I only see pictures with that engine.
I'm going to defer to Gary. Gary has seen it. He's been over there, so I'd like him to answer that.
I don't know if Gary's.
I think Gary Powers has left. He said I have to go enjoy the program.
Okay.
What was the question?
Well, as far as I know, she wants to know whether what's in Moscow is all the pieces of the U-2. My guess at it, I haven't seen it. I've seen pictures of it. My guess is it is everything they've collected. They're not hiding pieces of it. So everything you see in Moscow is what they
one piece that I have not been able to find any new pictures of that you can see in the old pictures is the tail. You can see Khrushchev surveying the tail, but there is no evidence of the tail being at the museum. The wreckage is at I think the Monino. It's at one of the museums, but the tail is nowhere to be found. Now,
of course, the picture that I showed Pranay with Khrushchev inspecting it, the tail was in that picture.
Yeah, I was just curious. And
in my briefing, the tail was there.
Yeah. No one was injured from the pieces of the aircraft falling, were they?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. All right.
in fact, there was a little known sideshow. The Soviets actually attempted. That's where I believe some of the missing pieces of the plane may have went. They attempted to reverse engineer the U-2, and they even built, at least they built a mock-up. It was called the Beriev S-13. It's the same Beriev company that builds the A-50 mainstay. So they built the Beriev S-13, at least a mock-up, but they were unable to make it light enough as the U-2. They just did not have the sheet metal capabilities.
Interesting. Anyone else with questions? Feel free to go off mute and please ask away.
John, if I remember, the SR-71 had very good side scan camera, like it could look into a country, like you could fly along the border and it could look inside. If the U-2 had that, could it have avoided the missile bases while still taking pictures by just like flying, let's say 40 kilometers to the side of them?
Yeah, the OBC camera on the SR-71 could look out 36 miles to the side. Cameras are best used looking near nadir. So we didn't really image real far out with the cameras. We imaged a lot further out with the radar. Yeah, it'd be a little bit better than what was flown on the U-2 in terms of how far to the side it could look, but not a lot.
Pranay, I don't know if you could tell the group, how did you connect with John, and how did you get interested in working on this project?
I've been very passionate. I'm an electrical engineer, and the reason I became an electrical engineer was I've been very passionate about defense systems and weapon systems. Basically, I read an Alistair MacLean novel in my childhood. If you read war novels, you will probably know him. He was a Scottish novelist. He wrote a lot of books about combat in World War II. And this particular book was about the sinking of the German battleship Bismarck. And he describes it like it's basically a blow-by-blow account. And he really tells you about the technology that, 1940s technology, signals, zeroing in on signals, tracing, early radar, all that kind. It's very interesting. So that I read that at a very young age. It got me into like defense technology. And I'm a very frequent visitor to the Air Force Museum. That's where I met John, at the SR-71 display.
Got it. Okay. So John, you're planning on publishing an update to that air power history article. And when are you projecting that will be due out?
Well, right now I'm thinking, hey, I'm worn out from 2 years of research. I can't tell you how I've got piles of papers and notes, and I don't have a time schedule yet, but if I do, it'll probably be later this year. This summer, I've got a lot of things I want to do. Maybe this fall, I'll start working on it. I know, especially if we can figure out a little bit more about how it really came down, I'd like to do an animation of the fall of the U-2. I'd like to recreate that and put that online along with the paper.
All right. And you're saying you're worn out from this. I was just going to ask you, what's your next project? What's the next analysis that you're going to embark upon?
You asked me that last time. I don't know. I don't really right now have any plans. I can tell you this, I never dreamed. This was kind of my COVID project when I had to sit in the basement for a year with nothing to do. I said, well, I might as well work with Chris Pocock and dig into this shoot down issue, and it led to more twists and turns you can shake a stick at, because there's more misinformation running through the Russian literature than you can shake a stick at. So I'm trying to sort out what's right, what's wrong, and I don't know. I'm just a little bit worn right now.
Well,
but I think I'm pretty much with this last shot from Sergey, I think he's filled in some missing pieces that I think are pretty well gelled. So I think I've pretty well got my arms around what happened.
yeah, no, fascinating stuff, and it really intriguing detective work. That's what really impresses me. So, and I'm very honored that tonight we're the first group that you've presented this updated information on. So thank you again for that.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I think we can call it an evening. On behalf of our audience and our organization, I want to thank you again for your generosity in presenting this evening. And for everyone else remaining on the line, please be sure to join us on June 9th for our next webinar. So thanks, everyone, and we will see you next month. And thanks, John. Stay safe.
I'll send you that list of links and so forth. If they want to link to some of those articles and read them themselves, they can just click the hyperlinks.
Oh, I will make sure I'll send a supplemental email out to everyone.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Fantastic. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.